Friends, this is the story of two children who, after a tragic accident, end up on a remote island in the Pacific Ocean and spend many years living there. Over time, as these children grow older, they undergo physical changes and begin to feel attracted to each other. What will these two ultimately do? And how did they arrive on this island? To find out, stay tuned until the end of the video. Now, let's begin the story. The story starts aboard a ship where a family is traveling. This family includes two children, a boy named Richard and a girl named Emmeline. They are cousins. Richard is accompanied by his father, and there is also a cook named Patty who prepares meals for everyone. One day, a fire breaks out on the ship, and smoke spreads everywhere, making it impossible to see anything. Patty quickly places the two children in a small boat and escapes from the burning ship. They spend the entire night in the boat. The next morning, Emmeline notices that they have reached an island nearby. She immediately wakes Patty up. When Patty sees the island, he becomes very happy. This island is rich with essential resources, including fresh water for drinking and abundant food for survival. This makes all of them feel relieved and happy. Patty finds several bottles of alcohol on the island, which further elevates his mood. On the other hand, Richard discovers a human skull and shows it to Patty. Upon seeing the skull, Patty realizes that someone else might have been on the island, either in the past or possibly even now. That night, while Patty is drinking, he hears some strange noises coming from the other side of the island. When he goes to investigate, he finds bloodstains on a rock and a piece of meat lying nearby. This scene terrifies Patty. He quickly returns to the children and strictly warns them never to venture to the other side of the island. Patty becomes increasingly worried but tries to carry on with life as usual. The following morning, Patty's bottles of alcohol start floating away in the water. In an attempt to retrieve them, he goes into the water. However, being intoxicated, he ends up drowning. The next morning, when the children wake up, they notice that Patty is missing. They search for Patty and eventually reach the other side of the island, where they find him dead. Seeing this, both children become extremely frightened, as Patty was the only one who looked after them, and now he was gone. The children were now completely alone on the island. At night, they sit together and talk. During this time, Emmeline tells Richard that she can no longer stay on this island and expresses her desire to leave. Richard agrees and decides to take Emmeline to another island. Upon reaching the new island, they build a house for themselves. Patty had taught them all the basic survival skills, so they knew how to live in such circumstances. Time passed, and they lived there for several years. By now, both had grown up, and their bodies were undergoing changes. They began to notice each other, and feelings for one another started to develop. However, these feelings were entirely unfamiliar to them. They had no education or guidance from anyone who could explain such matters to them. One day, Emmeline was bathing in the water when she noticed blood coming from her body. This sight startled her, and she called out to Richard. Soon, she realized that it was the start of her first menstruation. Richard arrived upon hearing her call and asked what had happened. Emmeline hesitated to tell him and asked him to leave. Seeing the blood in the water, Richard assumed that Emmeline was injured and insisted that she show him her wound. Emmeline refused to discuss it, which made Richard angry, as he thought she was hiding something. Frustrated, he walked away. Over time, the two grew closer to each other. One day, Emmeline heard the sound of drums. Following the sound, she discovered that it was coming from another part of the island. Upon reaching there, she found a large statue from which blood was flowing. This sight terrified Emmeline, and she immediately returned to tell Richard everything. Hearing this, Richard became furious because Patty had strictly forbidden them from going to the other side of the island and had made them promise not to do so. Seeing Richard's anger, Emmeline felt guilty. That night, Emmeline had a nightmare in which she saw Richard drowning in water and dying. This dream deeply scared her. She went to Richard and told him that she never wanted to lose him. Saying this, she hugged him tightly. Richard, too, became emotional and tried to get closer to her, but Emmeline didn't like his behavior and walked away. The next morning, Richard was preparing to leave for somewhere. Emmeline tried to stop him, but Richard, still angry, ignored her words and left. Emmeline goes after Richard to calm him down and sees him doing something behind a rock. Emmeline cannot figure out what Richard is doing. When she calls out to him, Richard angrily shouts at her. At that moment, Richard notices a boat approaching and immediately runs toward the hill where he had gathered some wood to light a fire and send a signal. However, by the time he gets there, the boat has already gone far away. Emmeline was also present there, and if she had wanted to, she could have lit the fire, but she didn't. This was because Emmeline had started to enjoy living on the island. Seeing this, Richard becomes even angrier at her. In his rage, he builds a raft and tries to sail away. However, the raft doesn't go far and capsizes in the water, causing Richard to fall. Emmeline sees this and starts laughing. Richard, embarrassed, comes back, and Emmeline mocks him. She sarcastically tells him that she knows what he was doing behind the rock. Hearing this, Richard gets furious and says, "You were spying on me." Emmeline replies, "When I am without clothes, you also watch me, and I know it very well." This makes Richard even angrier. He goes inside the hut and throws all of Emmeline's belongings outside. In his anger, he says, "I built this hut, and now you can't live here with me." Emmeline is forced to stay outside the hut. When it rains, she takes shelter in a small cave. Later, we see Emmeline taking a flower to the large statue. She had started considering the statue her god. While returning after placing the flower, her foot steps on a poisonous fish, which injures her. Richard had not seen Emmeline for several days, which made him worried. He goes to check on her at the place where she had been living. When Richard reaches there, he finds that Emmeline is very sick. Richard asks Emmeline what happened to her. Emmeline tells him that her foot stepped on a poisonous fish, which made her ill. She then requests Richard to take her to the statue. Richard carries Emmeline to the statue and prays there, asking for her quick recovery. After some time, Emmeline completely recovers. Following this, they start living together again. One day, while talking, Richard and Emmeline get close to each other and eventually establish a physical relationship. Now, they begin to understand the emotions they had been feeling for a long time, and they start enjoying those moments repeatedly. After a significant amount of time had passed, Richard began to feel that Emmeline was not giving him enough attention. He asked her if she no longer loved him. Emmeline replied that it was not the case but rather that she was feeling unwell and sensed something unusual in her stomach. She placed Richard's hand on her stomach, and he felt movement inside. In reality, Emmeline was pregnant, but neither of them knew this. One day, Richard ventured to the other side of the island and saw tribal people performing a human sacrifice. This sight terrified him, and he quickly returned to Emmeline. At that moment, Emmeline was experiencing severe pain in her stomach and was screaming loudly. Richard helped her, and Emmeline gave birth to a baby. Seeing the baby made them both very happy, and they brought him to their hut. After some time, the baby began to cry. They assumed that the baby was hungry, so they tried feeding him food and water. However, they were unaware that newborns do not need solid food or water but rather their mother's milk. Seeing the baby crying, Emmeline held him close to her chest, and the baby instinctively began breastfeeding. The baby was a boy, and they named him Patty in memory of their friend Patty. The couple started living a joyous life with their child and showered him with immense love. Several years passed, and their child grew older. One day, Richard went to the island where he and Patty had first arrived. Looking at the familiar surroundings, he reminisced about his childhood memories. On another day, their son stood near a plant and picked some poisonous berries, holding them in his hand. Later, as Emmeline got into the boat to return, the oar slipped from her hand and fell into the water, causing the boat to drift away. Emmeline called out to Richard for help, and he immediately ran and began chasing the boat. However, a shark started following Richard. To save Richard, Emmeline grabbed the other oar and threw it toward the shark, which caused the shark to swim away. Richard managed to climb into the boat, but they now had no means to control it. The boat continued to drift deeper into the sea. They spent a long time in the ocean and eventually became hungry. During this time, their child ate the poisonous berries, which Emmeline noticed. She became certain that their child wouldn't survive much longer. Seeing her distress, Richard decided that if their child were to die, they would also end their lives. Thus, both of them ate the same poisonous berries and became unconscious. However, the berries were not as lethal as they had believed, so all three only fell into a state of unconsciousness. Meanwhile, Richard's father saw their boat drifting in the ocean and reached them. He instructed his men to check on the people in the boat. Upon inspection, they found that all three were alive but unconscious. They rescued them, bringing them to safety. And this is where the story ends. Friends, if you like the story, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. See you in the next video.